Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to a conversation on artificial intelligence and content moderation. My name is Adam White. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's a real pleasure to get to have this conversation today, given that in recent weeks there's been a lot of conversations and debates about artificial intelligence. And in the last few years, there's been a lot of debates about content moderation on social media. We're very lucky to get to bring both of those subjects together today with a guest who really knows the substance of both of these issues. I'll introduce him in a moment, but first let me introduce the series that this conversation is part of. This is part of AEI's Digital Platforms in American Life project, an ongoing 2-year program in which we've brought scholars and practitioners, other experts together to discuss many, many aspects of the debates that are being had now about social media and other internet platforms, their relationship to our lives, their relationship to day-to-day governance. For the last couple of years, we've hosted a number of private working group discussions. We bring together the experts to talk about these issues, and out of those conversations came a series of papers, which you can find on AEI's website. We have a special purpose website for this. It's platforms.aei.org. And we're calling it these groups, the digital governance working groups. Now, many of the papers are already online. There are more coming soon, including one from my colleague here at AEI, Christine Rosen. And we even had a conference in September here at AEI where we discussed a number of those papers. Now, one of our authors was unable to make it to DC for that conference, but his paper was so fascinating that I immediately asked if he might be able to do a conversation like this on this webinar, and I'm so glad he could. His name is Alex Feerst. He leads Murmuration Labs, which helps tech companies address and mitigate the human and social risks of innovative products. Before that, he was head of legal and head of trust and safety at Medium, which many of you know is a great publishing platform, a blog kind of platform. He also was general counsel at Neuralink. He serves as an advisor to the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, and he's on the editorial board of the recently founded Journal of Online Trust and Safety. So Alex, thanks so much for writing the paper, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we jump into the conversation, here's one last thing. We'd love to hear everybody's own questions, and so please don't hesitate to submit them to us. You can do it either of two ways, and you can see this right now on the screen. You can email your questions to our colleague Sophie Rizzieri at aei.org, or you can go on Twitter and ask your question with the hashtag with hashtag AEI content moderation, and hopefully your comment or question won't get screened or moderated in the process. Sorry, dad joke. Okay, Alex, we'll jump right in. Before we get into AI and content moderation, let's talk about AI specifically. There's been so much in the news just in the last 2 weeks with OpenAI, the ChatGPT program, and all these related questions about what these tools actually are, what they're capable of, and what they might become capable of. So could you just give us a lay of the land, how we should think about AI right now?
Sure. Yeah, and it's an exciting time. I think it's as they're saying, I went I went bankrupt, like I fell in love gradually, and then all of a sudden, I feel like AI sort of came upon us in the same way. There have been developments over the past bunch of years, and this latest sort of benchmark, which is in transformers, which came out of the Google Brain project around 2017, are now sort of bearing these incredible public-facing developments. Like the T in GPT is transformer. This is this particular approach to doing generative AI. So I think we're dealing with an explosion of issues around ethics and intellectual property and what sectors are going to be changed by new tools that are available. Mm-hmm. I think we're also dealing with sort of one of the themes that I wrote about in the piece, which is as AI becomes more and more impressive, it actually might become harder to figure out the areas that it doesn't work so well, because the areas where it works well will be dazzling and impressive and, cause some people to attribute sentience to it, cause other people to perhaps trust it to be factually accurate when that is still unwise. And so I think at the same time as it's sort of stunning and impressive developments are happening that will be very useful, there's also an unevenness in what AI tools can and can't do that will sort of symbiotically remain difficult for us as we come to rely on them.
Yeah. Maybe just to get a sense of how the technology is changing. This is probably a bad metaphor, but I'll try it anyway. Should we think of this as sort of a straight line growth where we're just learning about something that's been proceeding steadily? Is this like a hockey stick where we're reaching a turning point where everything's going to move very rapidly? Or is it sort of a step progression where we're going up to a new step and now there'll be a little stability and then we'll go to another step?
Yeah. So I think it's probably somewhere between a step function and a hockey stick. Also in the sense that it's a closed loop in that, as we start to use these new tools, the development that we are capable of that is being re-input into AI data sets will also start to incrementally, to start to accelerate and advance, right? So like, similarly, like as people start using, GPT to code, then both our ability to create tools is going to accelerate, but also the inputs into other training data sets are also going to accelerate. So I think the each field that it touches, and like in the last 3 months, say, magazine illustration, I think people did not necessarily expect generative AI to come first for the artists.
Yeah.
Because for some people it was sort of like this ineffable human thing that we expected to happen last, or to happen late. But certainly, all of a sudden, lots of folks in the arts are dealing with, the fact that it is both a useful tool for many artists, but also has the possibility of making a lot of that labor either, cheaper or redundant, and is going to change the nature of what skills make you an artist, such as, we didn't think of writing good prompts as a important skill before, but perhaps those of us who couldn't draw so well but can write really awesome prompts, all of a sudden have a new utility on the market. And so there's a reconfiguration of a lot of these things very quickly.
That's very interesting. Let's talk for a moment too, just to sort of level set on social media content moderation, because again, this paper was part of a broader project that was focused on content moderation and the platforms. The entire project has been supported by a very generous grant by the Knight Foundation. Just a couple months ago, they hosted a conference down in Florida, bringing together lots of people from the number of the company's trust and safety departments, and from including journalists and policy folks and others, to talk about what's happening in content moderation on the platforms. So what's your sense of where we are in the content moderation debates? I mean, that's a huge question, obviously, but for somebody who previously was at Medium, sort of grappling with these issues in the front line, but also who knows the technology and the policy questions, what's your sense of those debates?
Yeah. So I've been sort of sitting with these issues for maybe 10 to 12 years, since the days when it was like a strange hobby. And now, now it is of interest to many. I guess one of the things I like to start with as like a backdrop, ground truth, is that the demand for adjudications, if you just think about adjudications over content or adjudications over speech or online conduct, the demand, now it's not even, but the need to make decisions that are implemented and that have an outcome for people has spiked tremendously in the past 10 or 15 years. And if you think about like how many adjudications happen in the world, in courts and in other places, now the need to make millions of extrajudicial determinations, and have one party that's happy and have one party that's unhappy, has gone up tremendously. And the cost, the amount of money that is allocated in the world for making these adjudications is sort of, we don't know how much is a reasonable amount to allocate.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why I think of this problem as like, it's a strange way to approach it, but it's a sort of like social economic issue, because it's very possible that the fully internalized cost of running an online internet sort of platform for expression must include the cost of doing millions of adjudications per day, if that's what it means to keep it stable and to keep people satisfied that it's fair. And so the fully loaded cost of running a platform includes making millions of speech adjudications per day. And you can sort of do them with people, or you can do them with automation, or some combination. Again, I get into this a bit in the paper, but in early days, I think people discounted it potentially to zero. But if you think about the enormity of that cost, very quickly you get to the point of, even if we're doing very skillful outsourcing and, with great accuracy, we're going to need automation to make the number of daily adjudications that we seem to need in order to process, all of the speech that everybody is putting online and all of the disputes that are arising that people are demanding that some authority figure adjudicate.
When you say adjudication, maybe you should spell out a little bit what you mean
Yeah.
by adjudication. Oftentimes, especially in Washington, when we hear the word adjudicate, we think about a court.
Yeah.
But and I guess at Facebook they have the oversight board, which was sort of modeled on a Supreme Court. Those decisions are a kind of adjudication. But when you say this high volume of adjudication, you're talking about very specific decisions at a much lower level of sort of in the decision chain. What do you mean by adjudication?
Right. And I sort of mean like a decision about some piece of content or some piece of conduct that happens online where two parties are having a dispute. So it's really, I think of it as like arbitration. If you think of Facebook as like having arbitration thrust upon it, by all of the people that come to you. Now, the way that the world looks like if you're trying to run a platform is that, and I tell folks this all the time, like nobody, I think, sets out to create a platform in order to control others' speech. That's not the goal. And that's not really what's fun from the perspective of a technologist. The fun part is making tools and connecting people and seeing all these things that happen. But nevertheless, what happens is that almost immediately you start getting emails, and those emails range from, how do I log in? And I lost my password to, very, very serious human problems like, somebody has posted my address and is threatening me. Somebody is stalking me, all these like much more serious and messy human problems. And so when I say adjudication, what I mean is you're in this private context, right? We have a private company generally, with a few exceptions, and they're being asked by one or several parties to make a decision because usually there's no way to split the baby, right? Usually it's like, either there can be a piece of content that publishes my address and tells people to come seek vengeance upon me, or there isn't, or that account exists or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And they're asking the platform to use its power to make a decision and then have everybody live with the consequences. And generally, at least one side will be unhappy with the outcome. And possibly all sides will be unhappy with the outcome. And so another element I guess that I haven't explicitly said so far is that previously, I think when we were largely following the natural laws of you say something and it is largely ephemeral unless you have some broadcasting technology or some recording technology, most things, even if they are harmful in a community, the scope of distribution and harm and permanence is limited by like the laws of physics. That it's not permanent, it's not broadcast very widely, it's not necessarily remembered exactly as it was. Whereas with the internet and with platforms, you can sort of selectively repeal some of these laws of physics and cause things to be permanent, cause things to be distributed very widely, very suddenly, and all these other things. And that to me is where there's nothing new about speech disputes or the need for adjudication, but the demand for them has skyrocketed because the potential for harm has also multiplied based on all these like factors that have been selectively altered by the electronic environment.
Yeah, and maybe just to think once more about the pace of change on these things. I'm curious, when you were general counsel at Medium, about what percentage of your day-to-day work involved these kinds of questions? And if you were in a similar position at a similar platform today, how much of your work do you think would be these kinds of decisions?
Yeah. So they only generally go in one direction, which is that the more you grow, the more there are. I've never known a company, and I've advised, I don't know about dozens, but I've advised many companies on how to deal with this sort of work, and they only ever go up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending, you can try to sand the edges off or do other things, but pretty quickly you need a team that deals with it exclusively, right? Which is like the trust and safety team or certain lawyers that are tasked with it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would say is that besides the fact that it is increasingly a politicized issue now, in the past, especially since 2016, it's there's dealing with the political implications of it. My experience is that over time, new phenomena, new institutions, and new political issues get sort of folded into this existing problem. So, for example, disinformation and health is not a new problem. And how do you establish provenance and scientific reliability? And vaccines has always been an issue that we dealt with, for decades now. But COVID sort of put a new spin on this, and so created a new sense of urgency, created a new sense of skepticism of watching CDC and WHO and other institutions interact in real time, and maybe new groups that their political views attached to different aspects of this debate, right? And so another one might be the availability of information for how to seek abortions, which was not necessarily a thing you had a team to deal with before. But now, if your platform is a tool for people helping others, find those services in different states and go from state to state as the states are considering passing laws around this, each new issue has its own potential implication for you. And obviously, elections around the world is another area where in 2005, when folks founded, as I say, communication tools, their goals were not to sit down and think, oh, we should have an election protection team and view ourselves as election monitors. But now, if you have a platform of any size, you have to think about the ways to mitigate the risks that your tools are going to be used to interfere with some kind of election. So over time, I would say both the issues sort of multiply, and the complexity of the way that they interact with each other has also sort of multiplied.
Yeah, if we could all hop in a time machine and go back to the dorm room where Mark Zuckerberg was first creating the Facebook.com, and explain to him that what he was doing was going to put him in charge of the of all speech and the viability of all elections, he might have been a little bit surprised by that. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. No. Nobody. That's not the fun part. I mean, I think people are understandably sort of dismayed by the power, but I would say nobody seeks that power. People seek obviously profit, and people seek growth and market dominance maybe, but taking people in good faith, that is sort of the byproduct of connecting human beings. And one of the things when newer startups come talk to me about this stuff, one of my sort of like philosophical views on it is like, this is not a problem to be solved. I think like techno-solutionism is a sort of discourse and framing that, and perhaps the tech world is responsible for this framing because we present ourselves as solutions to problems. But to me, absolutely, the incentives and the particular set of artificial mechanisms and incentives that you create around a platform absolutely exacerbate and cause certain types of flare-ups and certain types of interactions. So there's responsibility to be taken there. But some of it, of course, is just humans being human. Right. And my view is like, humans are not a problem to be solved. We are a condition to be managed. And so you're never going to get it down to zero. You're going to be mitigating and dealing with percentages and probabilities and other types of harms that you deem like within some set of tolerances that are not so destructive that they metastasize into something worse. So it's a very, I would say, subjective and qualitative set of human issues that are nested within a set of like quantitative and highly technical institutions and tools.
Yeah. Alex, the reason why I picked Mark Zuckerberg as the example is not just because he's one of the most famous creators of a platform, but because your paper starts with a quote from Mark. And again, this paper, it's titled "The Use of AI in Online Content Moderation." It's available on the AEI on AEI's website at platforms.aei.org. But Alex starts with a quote from March 2021, where Zuckerberg says, quote, "More than 95% of the hate speech that we take down is done by an AI and not by a person. And I think 98 or 99% of the terrorist content that we take down is identified by an AI and not a person." You begin with that quote to illustrate how much of a role AI is already playing in this, but much of your paper is a cautionary story. It's an argument on how AI isn't going to solve all of these things. And in fact, the more we understand the challenge of content moderation, the more we understand both the prospects for and limits of AI in content moderation. Maybe a good place to start, Alex, is with the concept of minimum viable moderation. I think that's where you start, right? You say, let's just assume away arguments over how much to moderate. Let's just begin with minimum viable moderation, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea that a platform would only moderate or take down content where they have a direct legal obligation to do so, especially a legal obligation in the form of a court order directing the platform to take down specific information. Is that minimum viable moderation? And if I got it right, why don't you explain why AI even brushes up against limits in that context?
Yeah, and so this is part of my experience, and I think for a lot of folks who've worked in this field for a while, is that there's a somewhat predictable set of steps that, experiences that people go through when they decide that they want to study and think about this. And generally, one of the first things people say is like, oh, we care a lot about speech. We want to maximize the amount of, of speech out there. So we should only intervene to the minimum necessary and no more than that. And that's very understandable. And I think a lot of the folks who get into this work care about doing exactly that, about protecting as much speech that might otherwise not see the light of day, and finding, increasing our accuracy and increasing our tools to make sure that we are not over removing, right? Because the incentive is to over remove. I'll return to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So if you start with that minimum, with that goal, I think a few things become apparent that I sort of write about. And the first one, whether it's done by AI or human, is that a lot of this, what I'm calling adjudication, happens in an extrajudicial context, right? So the cost of going to court and getting a court order, with top lawyers or even not so top lawyers, is going to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars generally on something like defamation or, a right of publicity case or a privacy tort. And so the federal courts and civilians and normal people do not have the budget to go seek a court order every time they want a Facebook or a Twitter to intervene. So if you make that your rule, you're going to have very few interventions based on disputes, right? That's like one set of, because it's an extrajudicial dispute and somebody can, two people, one person says this is defamation, the other person says this is not defamation, and you don't really find out until the umpire calls it as a ball or a strike. And so, you got to go to a judge or jury. Then there's other things where you say, okay, what are actually illegal to carry? And there's nuance here where there's content which is illegal, say, for a person to publish, but it is not necessarily illegal for a host to host, right? So there's copyright issues and others there. But if you look at the most taboo and most illegal of all types of content, usually at the extreme is what's called CSAM, child sexual abuse material.
Yeah.
And so, nobody wants to carry this, and so that is perhaps easy in the sense that if it hits against a known database of bad things, that you are supposed to remove it. However, once you deviate from this known database of known illegal material, the amount of human subjective disagreement over whether something breaks a particular law or not winds up being pretty substantial. Mm-hmm. And the more subjective it gets, the more that's going to differ. So I think thing one, I guess, is when you're in an extrajudicial context, even dealing with human disagreement over what is violating a particular law or not is going to be massive, right? And eventually you'll get lawyers writing letters on both sides. And this is why I say also adjudication, if you don't aspire to be a court, and perhaps none of us aspires to be a court, people will treat you like a court because the platform has the power to take something down or not. So you will have the experience of people treating you like a court and getting letters from lawyers on both sides threatening you, right? And so the mere fact that this is all about an extrajudicial dispute that will never see a judge or jury means that the number of decisions, either to do something or to do nothing, that will be the basis of disagreement is in the millions. Yeah. And this is sort of why I say that the only outcome is that everybody is mad at you, right? Because people, we all believe strongly that our opinions are, we universalize them and say, well, that's clearly illegal. But in fact, it's not so clear, especially when other human beings disagree with you. And this gets, I guess, to one of the other points of the paper, which is there's, I think, massive disagreement and understandable incentive to disagree or to misrecognize subjectivity problems and accuracy problems,
Yeah.
right? So we might disagree on should hate speech be illegal or not, but it's in the US, it's not for the most, but then we might disagree on if a platform has a private rule against, say, hate speech. We will disagree massively on whether a particular instance of it does or does not violate that rule. And if we poll 100 people, we'll probably get 90 different opinions. And part of my point is that AI cannot solve that human subjective disagreement problem. All it can do is more efficiently multiply this problem. So if you're dealing with a subjectivity problem, AI will never be able to change anything about that, because all AI can do is a bunch of other things. It cannot cause humans to disagree about something that is subjective.
Yeah, Alex, I just want to drop a footnote here in the conversation. One of the things that strikes me anytime I look at what's happening in the platforms and the policy debates around the platforms, I'm reminded so much of much longer arguments around the areas that I tend to do focus on the most, which is on public administration, administrative law. I often think that what's happening at the platforms, among other things, is just a very fast replay of about 100 years worth of debates over the power that agencies have and the processes that agencies should subject themselves to when making policy. And what you just described about the different levels of different layers of disagreement around content moderation, it reminds me so much about, in American politics, we'll argue over what the law should be, and then if Congress passes a law and an agency has to administer it, the agency has to first look at the law and decide, well, what does the law really mean? There's always some vagueness around the standard, the rule itself. And then even if you get a picture, a perfectly clear picture of what the law actually means, you're still going to bump up into ambiguity about whether the facts at hand in a given case fit the law or not. And you have this layer upon layer of ambiguity and opportunity for disagreement. And I see that in what you just described here with the platforms having to first define the rule sets, or understand the rule sets they've been given by Congress or by states, and then after making their own rule sets, having to apply them. You're going to get disagreement all the way up and down, and whether it's the general counsel's office at the company or whether it's the head and trust and safety, if that's a separate position in a particular company, they wind up having to decide those cases looking, as you said, often at letters from this lawyer and trying to adjudicate in the middle.
Yeah, and let me jump in. I think that's very right and very astute. I think the extra then layer is that the company itself is risk managing, right?
Yes.
Because they're also going to be subject to eventually to what some court might say or not say about it. And so in making that kind of adjudication, of course, they're trying to apply their rules fairly and consistently and honestly. And the mental model there for me, by the way, is like you sort of have the law, which is the floor. In a given jurisdiction, this is the law. And then on top of it, each platform may set up its own private rules, which are sort of like, however you want to think of it, is like rulemaking or whatever on top of it, which is extra, thinking about this stuff. But the over removal incentive that I mentioned earlier comes out of the fact that if you're the general counsel's office or whatever, if you're being a good risk manager, you're balancing, risk management for the company with maximizing your users' ability to express themselves, right?
Yeah.
But it is very often the case that any one user or any one dispute, if it is going to lead to multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars in legal fees, it's probably not rational to leave it up, right?
Yeah.
You are highly incentivized to err on the side of taking things down, because now you may out of principle say, no, we have to draw the line here. We have to have a backbone about this. We are going to spend this money and demonstrate where we think the correct place for the line is, even though we're under pressure. But if you're being a pure pragmatist and a risk manager and something is on the line, the thing that scholars have observed is that you're incentivized to over remove, because over remove will shut people up and get them off your back and cause you to have less risk. And that is sort of, from a speech perspective, not great. And so you have this question of precision. We want to have surgical precision about what we do in an area that is highly disputed, what the line is. And so I think as more folks are regulating, as the states are starting to regulate, as Europe increasingly is regulating, one of the concerns becomes the more you have a patchwork of laws across jurisdictions, more institutional actors who think they know one way or the other, the incentives to over remove sort of multiply, because things can be a risk from one or multiple angles. And so getting back to your point about minimum viable moderation, this is sort of in tension with itself. It's like if you have a sort of speech maximizing set of values, it costs real dollars and cents to go out there in the world and say, well, we're going to defend that by doing our best to not over remove, because governments will get mad at you, activists will get mad at you, private companies and advertisers perhaps will get mad at you, and at some point the metaphor of like physical courage and having a backbone sort of breaks down, because you're sort of acting against the interests of your shareholders, if you're a private company. And so even if your values are explicitly spelled out as X, Y, and Z, within the confines of sort of quarter to quarter Delaware C corporation, New York Stock Exchange capitalism, you're going to be highly constrained.
Yeah. That was the last set of incentives I wanted to point to. And everything you've identified, just within the company making these decisions, it seems to me there are one set of incentives is just the basic principles that motivated the creation of the platform in the first place. And I don't just mean like free speech principles. I just mean whatever it was that caused the founder of this company or founders to create it in the first place. There's, of course, the liability, minimizing actual legal or financial liability, right? That side of risk mitigation. But at the same time, if it's a publicly traded company, or even just a public company of any kind, a privately held company, there's the incentive to just maximize the value of the company itself. And if you're a publicly traded company, you have real obligations to do that as a matter of law in many places. And of course, those three bundles of incentives, the legal liability, maximizing value for the shareholders, and then just sort of the principles that animated the creation of the platform. There's not always clear lines between the three, but there are sort of in general big differences between those sets of incentives, and they all have to be balanced somewhere inside of the company.
And I think, and this speaks, I think, a little bit to the emergence of the trust and safety function, which I view as sort of, related to the emergence of ethics, and sort of technology ethics as a thing people are concerned with, but also are not sure how to operationalize. Mm-hmm. It's not really part of how Delaware law thinks about, things. And so, for example, when you have the content that is things that you may be incentivized to take down, either because it's illegal or because it's distasteful to a large number of your users, or because it has what appears to be a high likelihood of causing physical violence. There's a number of reasons, right? It is often potentially low value, not in the sense of my subjective cultural value, but just money, right? It is not necessarily what is useful to advertisers. And so you have two incentives often to remove this, because it is like, in principle, perhaps legal, but it is irksome at best to lots of people and potentially dangerous. And that it is also costing you money in terms of your business model, right?
Right.
And so the trust and safety function, I would say, is often at odds with the other folks. And one of the reasons I think it is separate than the legal function is the reason we were just talking about, which is it's not pure risk management, right? You're trying to mitigate human harms and address human impact. But then also, I think a lot of folks who do this work, and perhaps some people would say inappropriately, view themselves as answering to some higher authority, which is they may get overruled. They may say, like, look, the legal office says this is too risky. That's fine. The chief growth officer or the chief business officer or the chief operating officer says this is terrible brand risk. We're going to get beat up in the New York Times and other places for this. It doesn't make sense for us to do this. Procter & Gamble is going to pull out their ads from us. It doesn't make sense. And the trust and safety team would say, like, that's fine too. You can vote and overrule us. But we are answering to some ethical set of obligations, which is to mitigate harm to users, non-users, democratic institutions, abstractions like, human rights. And we don't have institutions that operationalize these obligations super well yet. But I think it speaks to a desire among lots of people to have something other than the sort of tripartite business interests you named as governing all the decision making.
Yeah. Now, Alex, my favorite part in the paper is one of the turning points where you say it's great to talk about sort of the generalities of this, the high principle of it, but we have to be practical, or the companies themselves have to be practical. You say at some point you have to move from figuring out your philosophy to drafting your rules and enforcing them. You need to translate the rule set into action. And as fascinating as free speech doctrine is, running a social media company is a practical business, not an academic enterprise. And so maybe this is the proper turning point then to look at the practicality of AI then with the broad concepts of content moderation. At the second half of your paper, you focus on what AI is actually going to be good for, useful for in content moderation, and where its limits and maybe even its drawbacks could be. And this is, again, not looking so much at broadly at how much moderation is too much or not enough, but no matter what the level of moderation a company wants to go at, it's going to see benefits from AI and moderation, and it's going to see limits. So let's talk about start with the benefits. We'll start on the bright side of this. What's AI actually good for in content moderation?
Yeah, so it's good for tons of stuff. I think that's sort of like the good news. And it, and as AI, we'll sort of say like ML, AI, and all the general like detection tools and rule engines and things that you have. So one way that I sort of think about framing the problem is that when you're experiencing, and we call it content moderation, and that sort of comes out of this assumption that the way that you do it is that you inspect the content and then you make some sort of decision. And that's true to an extent that, yes, of course, you're looking at the four corners of some content. But when you're examining what is happening in the context, you are often, in my view, looking at more data, right? You're looking at an expanded data set. And this goes to, I believe, the point that like there is a line between what is content and what is really conduct, or not to get too abstract, but really it is online conduct, some of which is sort of manifested as content, right? So like if you're harassing somebody, yes, you might put up a nasty picture of them, but and a person can look at that picture and pronounce upon the picture and what they think. But really what you need is more context to understand what's going on. Like what is the larger expanded set of context and conduct at issue.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the data that we collect and that we have as part of the normal course of doing social media, you have lots of data that is extremely helpful. So I'll just give a couple examples. This trust and safety or content moderation stuff is often, it's not really one problem. It's really like 30 problems bundled together under one thing. So thinking about totally different sets of problems. So for example, in the sort of disinformation, space where you think about not good faith actors, but you think about campaigns by adversarial actors, military, private, commercial, whatever, could be foreign state actors, could be teenagers trying to sell supplements who are intentionally messing around with what's happening on your platform, making content that is bad faith, making content that is perhaps factually true, but problematic in the way that it interacts with things or takes other things out of context. If you look at other things such as just the first layer of metadata, IP addresses, right? Where are these folks located? Who are they associated with? If you analyze a network, right? Which users are associated with which users did they used to be associated with, which groups did they used to be associated with, the larger sort of social graph that we collect data for in the first place, you can learn all sorts of stuff that can help trip circuit breakers or help trip red flags and say, these are not necessarily good faith actors, or these actors are not who they say they are. Let's investigate further and figure out what's going on. And that can be true in a campaign for harassment or political, interference with an election. It could be true for somebody who's targeting a brand, and trying to go after, say, an oil company. So there's lots of areas where looking at things that are forms of data and looking for patterns in that data can give you some really good background context. And machine learning is great for that stuff, right? It's great for discerning patterns. It's great for alerting people to anomalies. It's great for looking at large levels of associations that are difficult to fake. So all of those tools, which have been available for a while in different forms, are extremely useful to do investigations.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is this is a great way to just shrink the data set of things that actually do require more specific human judgment, right? At the outset of your paper, you point out that if there are 500 million tweets a day, then that's 200 billion tweets a year. There are 50 billion photos uploaded to Instagram. 700,000 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every day. The numbers are just mind-boggling. And so the first tool that the first benefit of AI and content moderation is just looking through all of that noise for the signal of things that actually do require some human judgment.
Exactly. And you can imagine like because virality is still sort of, relevant. If you're trying to mitigate, if you think about harms, right? Like we've been talking about the expressive dimension of speech and sort of its contents. Then there's this sort of like functional, consequential aspect of speech of like what harms might it cause and like what effects might it have in the world. If you're looking to say like, okay, we are not going to concern ourselves momentarily with like these expressive aspects. We're going to think about these functional and harm aspects. Virality, how many people are seeing this? How quickly? Is this piece, going haywire? Things like these sort of automated systems can alert you to them quicker so you can triage things and get them in front of people. It can also sort of triage them in a way that gets them in front of the right people, because once you have a platform or of a company of reasonable size, you're generally breaking your teams up into like different subject matter experts.
Yeah.
So you get in front of the right people. And then in extreme circumstances, you can imagine having circuit breakers, which some folks have. Like, if something that appears to be election related is going viral beyond a certain quantum, let's just stop it for a minute and have a human inspect it and see what's going on, do some kind of test. And I think I think that gets at actually one of the big questions, which is when are we comfortable having automation or AI take action?
Yeah.
And when are we comfortable with it's just being used to surface things to human beings? Yeah. So that's sort of, I think, one of the Rubicons that you cross, because sure, using triage and detection and sorting and categorization and even saying like, 90% confidence interval, we think this is blah, blah, blah. That's one thing. But having automated decision-making, I think for a lot of people, and I think I say this somewhere in the paper, like there's a dignitary humanistic intuition there that says like we've done something serious to have automated decision making.
Well, you definitely say that. Maybe we'll turn to that, because we've just sort of outlined the beneficial uses of AI content moderation, just in shrinking the task at hand in moderation. But then when you turn to some of the challenges or limits of AI, or some of the risks of AI, using AI in this context, one of them that you cite is dignity, and you mean sort of the sense that there's well, actually, why don't you'll put it better than I will. Well, what's the dignity issue in AI content moderation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to like, and for me, a lot of my background is in the humanities. The same folks who will say like, look, AI can never create true art because it doesn't suffer. I think was it Nick Cave wrote something this last week about generative AI, saying, AI has never suffered, and so it can't create real art. It can create mimicry, but it can't create true art that comes out of a human experience.
Yeah,
I think there's a mirror image to that on the processing side, which is some people would say speech is in the end so personal and so nuanced and such an outgrowth of human expression that at the end of the day, I'm not comfortable with 100% automated speech adjudication, and what it says about people, what it says about our ability to trust it. The other side of that, I think, is people would say like it's just math. It's just like all we're doing is applying statistical models to what decisions get made by humans when they label and look at this data set, with different levels of supervision or whatever. But that this is a sort of I would say quasi mystical or or other sort of ineffable concept that people are over indexing on, that something is happening here that's so different than a person just using mathematical models to do what they would do anyway.
Yeah, this too, I mean, has a real analog to the sorts of things we think about in law and administration. In the 1960s into the 70s, when you had an explosion of federal or state and local benefits programs, welfare, and so on, there are real questions about the process that the state needed to go through in order to take away benefits from somebody who was receiving them. And oftentimes it was phrased in terms of dignity. Somebody deserved, if nothing else, just some kind of day in court or some kind of hearing where they could talk to somebody face to face rather than be dealt with at many, many arm's length through paper, through letters and so on. That there is this sense that the dignity in a mass justice system requires some kind of, if only fleeting, some kind of touch point with an actual human being who's going to see you face to face before they make a consequential decision about your case. And by the way, I just add, to extend the metaphor, some of the most interesting issues right now in administration and administrative adjudication are about AI on exactly this reason. The high volume agency adjudications, which tend to be veterans benefits, immigration, Social Security, those are areas where there's talk about how AI might simplify things. There's really interesting work coming out of Stanford's Law School from Daniel Ho and David Engstrom and a professor at NYU, Catherine Sharkey, looking at AI in mass adjudication in federal administration. And they're having the same questions about, well, how dignified is this? Do we owe more to the actual people that come before these tribunals?
Yeah, and I think it also gets at a potential irony, which is that if you sampled human adjudications, whether they're dignified or not, you might find that they're not very consistent.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
And so we also, our baseline of what is like a consistent or dignified proceeding, I think, is a little bit set in our imaginations, because it's not a thing that we've like empirically, in my view, like we've never really established with this level of systematization. And even like maybe like an abstracted way to think about this for a second is that again, platforms did not set out to become private arbitration data collections, but they sort of have become that despite themselves.
Yeah.
And if you compare, and even the, like I said, the unit cost of adjudication, like it's like, okay, we need to get each decision down to less than 3 cents or we're dead. That's not a thing that courts ever do, really. Yeah. I know folks think intensely about their budget, but the sort of due process and justice and dignitary concerns are always in the mix there in a particular way for public, for public law, where, people don't necessarily say like, well, that's the federal courts, whatever their budget is, $6 billion, and that's as much justice as we can afford. And that there it is. Whereas with private companies, I think the rubber hit the road a bunch sooner, because you have both data collections and you also have folks whose job is to say like, okay, realistically, if we have demand for 800,000 adjudications a day, we got to figure out how to do this.
Yeah. So that was the first limit or risk in AI content moderation, is the need for dignity in the process. Another that you focus on, and I think you put first on the list, is the questions about bias that's embedded, that could be embedded in the logic of an AI tool's decision making. Why don't you outline that a little bit?
Yeah, and so there's, by this point, there's lots of folks doing, work on all sorts of like algorithmic bias and AI bias, and I sort of, my shorthand for this is like, if you train your models on an unjust world, they're not going to produce justice. Right? Like we've trained them on our imperfect human existing world. So it's very understandable that in some ways they replicate and amplify our biases. And so there's lots of ways that folks look at this. There's sort of like race and gender, and there's all that. By the way, even before you use AI, a lot of adjudication systems and platforms are already so problematic, right? And folks who look at the data professionally tend to say like the people who suffer the most from this over removal incentive are generally, say Muslims who are not terrorists, or, or whatever, trans folks, or folks who are near some line of adjudication where it's more efficient to sweep them into some other category, right? And so with AI, I think the likely trend of those problems being amplified and becoming less possible to discern it seems are very likely, because what you're doing is continuing down that road. And then, like I said, in a closed loop, continuing to sort of amplify those, those apparent boundaries. So there's lots of folks who write on this very intelligently. I am not one of them, but I think along many axes, you can say like, again, we train, and also the training, I think lots of folks, this is becoming more visible now, but it sounds like a black box, but a lot of training is really just human beings sitting there and mechanical turking, and brute forcing their way through labeling lots of data. And so you scratch the surface, this is sort of like it's turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
It's imperfect humans all the way down. You might have a data lake that looks very pristine, but a lot of data sets, the labeling is done through lots of different complicated ways. And just one other thing I'd like to advert to, which is like, as we get into the question of generative AI and scraping, a lot of these data sets, the provenance of the data sets would sort of shock people that, they started out being collected by professors or nonprofits. Then, they got transferred to somebody else. That other person forgot about that limitation. Then it was used commercially. Then it was picked up by the Chinese government. There's sort of shocking, because also a lot of companies are not necessarily enthusiastic to disclose exactly what data sets and what training data they have used. There's lots of sort of, whatever you want to call them, dark pools or pink slime or whatever, that are out there with tremendous imperfections that are being reuptaken into our decision making.
Yeah, and so the last limit of AI and content moderation that you allude to is just the basic challenge of dealing with dynamic adversaries. That those who are affected by content moderation and who want to continue to post and amplify their content online and get around content moderation, they are not sort of standing still. They're learning from the process, they're creative, and oh, by the way, they will increasingly have AI tools of their own with which to try to evade detection by AI. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and even before one gets to like truly adversarial, like I said, like foreign state actors say, like this possibility of sort of what I'm calling pink slime, or like the internet of garbage, is that you'll have a lot of AI generated stuff out there, because if it is provocative in the right ways or bland in the right ways, you can generate tremendous volumes. If one of the strategies of manipulating attention and manipulating social media is to sort of flood the field with garbage, then AI is an incredible tool for producing whatever you want at volume. And so even if it is not especially nefarious, even if it is just, as I said, people trying to sell supplements or people screwing around or other things, you can see the ability to produce things in volume is going to be, tremendously leveling for that. And then on top of that, when you have all the other sort of security issues and all the other potential for AI to be used for, to bang on your different detection walls all day, it's for people who like this work, it's like, never ending cat and mouse, and it keeps you sharp. And I think for people who would like to solve problems, it's sort of endless whack-a-mole, and the notion that nothing really stays solved very long.
Yeah, our colleague here at AEI, Jake Easter, who manages our technology policy program, he points out that at some point, content moderation aided by AI will be largely in the business of reviewing content produced by AI. You'll have AI content moderation judging Chat GPT content, and I suppose at some point we'll have ever exponentially more of that, and that'll be front and center in what's actually being moderated. How did that kind of arms race actually play out, do you think?
Yeah, this is a vision of the internet that is actually sort of plausible. This is like a Philip K. Dick dystopian view that in the future we're all going to sort of like wander around in the digital wilderness looking for other humans.
Yeah.
And being surrounded by fake humans. Yeah. It's potentially very plausible. And I think you even saw early versions of this with like DMCA requests, notice and takedown, because like, YouTube gets, I would guess, millions of DMCA notices per day. Yeah. And then they have an AI, they have automation respond. And so, another thing I would say is like one of my sort of experiences when you're dealing with potentially, like a bad faith state actor who is putting up garbage or putting up, misinformation or disinformation to try to interfere, those folks will often be the ones who quote, First Amendment doctrine at you chapter and verse, and sort of, it's like roughing the kicker. Like the people who will like protest the loudest and quote, quote different dissents at you are often people who are doing things in bad faith and are not who they say they are. And so to me, this is on that spectrum of like, once you have automation, a world where you have a bunch of harmful disinformation and hundreds of bots like screaming at you about the First Amendment rights of theirs that you're violating seems super plausible.
Yeah.
I imagine there will be other tools to help us create more filters for ourselves,
Yeah.
right? I think like there's folks who say like, oh, everybody should probably someday be issued a personal AI, so that you can have something looking out for your best interests, or at least like implementing your filter preferences when you say like, okay, my preferences are X, Y, and Z. I have an AI product that's going to filter my whatever dashboard, my front door. Now, if it's a commercial AI that's run by advertising, you sort of replicated a lot of the same attention hacking problems that we have now. So there's like, I think interesting questions around like legal entity and commercial business model for doing this. But it seems likely that like the things that are the problems will also be used to try and solve them. And hopefully we won't be wandering around searching for other humans. But I think the notion that there will be like robots on all sides is probably it's in some level inevitable.
Yeah. Another question from the audience, Ted Hurt, who's a lawyer, he points out that in law, in addition to agency adjudication and the things I've been mentioning, we see things like class action lawsuits, mass tort lawsuits, cases where you bring together a lot of plaintiffs and often a lot of defendants all together into one case to settle an issue once and for all. And he wonders, Ted wonders, are there any disputes in the social media environment that you think are susceptible to that similar kind of aggregate justice approach inside of these privately owned platforms?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I guess I'll try to answer it like a couple of ways.
Sure.
I think the sort of like crudest and simplistic way to answer it is like, but like they're not similarly situated, right? Because like if we each say a different thing and we each have a grievance about our expression, it's not really amenable to class action type remedies because of that in some ways, the ineffability and the singularity of speech is exactly what makes it hard to make it a class. But I can totally see like leaving that aside, like, okay, yes, let's say we bundle all of the abuse harassment or all of the, terrorism cases into one bundle, which I guess is what the Supreme Court is kind of trying to do with the Google and Twitter cases, is like produce some sort of definitive answer about where the line is on, hosting alleged terrorism. I suppose it could be useful for helping establish some kind of consensus or legal like rule on where the rule is. But what it doesn't do for me is help make adjudications, right? Because the whole point is like each individual instance tends to raise these like nuanced human expression issues. So it doesn't strike me super amenable. And maybe another funny sort of, I think, brain twisty aspect of what makes these questions so interesting is that the UK Online Harms Report sort of ran square into this problem, and Eric Goldman has written about it a bunch, which is like you have illegal speech, you have legal speech, and then the UK Online Harms Report tried to come up with like a third category, which is like legal but don't do it.
Yeah.
And I think people like sort of understandably made fun of this because it's like, well, it's either illegal or it's legal. Yeah. Let's not come up with quasi illegal, And so often I think this type of thinking leads to that problem, which is like, we know that there are things that are harmful in the aggregate. We are not comfortable with making them illegal at the individual actor level, like lying, because of the First Amendment and other things. We're maybe comfortable with saying if a platform in the aggregate hosts a lot of this harmful speech and it does something with an algorithm that we're not happy with, we will maybe want to call it illegal. But I think all of these things are us struggling with this third category of things that are harmful in the aggregate in certain circumstances, but which are still legal. And so we don't know what to do with it. And so making it illegal for a third party to carry something that is legal to say for the first party actor also sort of, I think, turns into nonsense. Class falls apart because of this question.
Okay. Well, Alex, we're almost out of time, but just really quick in this last 30 seconds or so, I always like to ask somebody who's at the cutting edge of these technologies, these policy issues, what's the issue that's not squarely on our radar now that you think we'll be talking about a lot a year from now or 2 years from now? What's sort of the most underrated aspect of these debates that will catch up with us before long.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I struggle with and think about a lot nowadays is honestly attribution and transparency. Because I think changing the behavior of people and changing the behavior of technology is going to be very hard. But you even see with the early generative AI stuff happening now, people, there seems to be, again, a dignitary or a human intuition that you want to know when you are dealing with a bot,
Yeah.
or that you want to know that you are reading a paper where I was assisted in my first draft by GPT. And so I think some of this obsession with provenance and obsession with transparency around method is going to be a new interesting, because it's not an area that the law especially has cared about. It is an area that plagiarism and other ethical systems have cared about and might be very difficult to legislate. But I think these obsessions with provenance and with where the human being is are going to keep getting more important.
That's interesting. Just in the last couple of days, I thought I saw or read somewhere, maybe in the context of universities are worried that all their students' papers are going to be written by ChatGPT. Maybe the creators of ChatGPT itself put out a statement somewhere saying they would like to see users of ChatGPT in those contexts be sure to disclose that these things were drafted by ChatGPT. Well, in any event, Alex, we are out of time, so we'll bring you back a year from now to talk about that issue. But in the meantime, first of all, I want to thank the Knight Foundation again for supporting this ongoing project at AEI on digital platforms in American life. I want to thank all of our authors in the series so far and those to come. Thank our audience. But most of all, Alex, thank you for participating in the program and writing this fascinating paper that I hope people will read.
Thank you, Adam. This is fun talking.
Yeah, likewise. And again, the title of the paper, you can get it on platforms.aei.org, is The Use of AI in Online Content Moderation. There's a subtitle, which is, or the tech sector invested in automation, and all I got was questionable adjudication. So thanks again, Alex. And please tune in, everybody, for the next webinar here at AEI.
Thank you.